Billy Graham was born on November 7, 1918, to William Franklin Sr. and Murrow Coffrey Graham in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a dairy farm. Since he grew up in the Great Depression, he learned the value of hard work. Although his parents were faithful Christians, Billy didn't really care for God or religion or church in his early life. His brother used to say that in his early teenage years, all Billy cared about was baseball and girls. He was a normal teenage boy. In 1934, around Billy's 17th birthday, evangelist Mordecai Ham came to Charlotte and held a revival for several weeks. Under Ham's preaching, Billy and a few of his friends accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Mordecai Ham later said that in Billy's thinking at that time, his hero was Babe Ruth, who Billy had met as a boy. Our meeting changed his hero from Babe Ruth to Jesus Christ. After Billy's conversion, he felt like God was calling him to be a minister. After his first revival in 1939, he became a Baptist minister, and in May 1940, he graduated from the Florida Bible Institute. He was now a full-time preacher. After he finished Bible school, he was enrolled in Wheaton College in Chicago. There he met his future wife, Ruth Bell. Ruth Bell was the daughter of missionaries from China, where she had been born. She was well known around campus for her deep spirituality and mischievous fun. In August 1943, Billy and Ruth married. Ruth described Billy saying he wanted to please God more than any man she had ever met. Billy joined Youth for Christ, an international evangelistic movement for young people, as a minister for $75 a week. Billy Graham went on to preach in over 400 crusades around the world from 1947 to 2005. He spoke in well over 100 countries on 6 continents and in all 50 U.S. states. The Los Angeles Crusade in 1949 brought him into the public eye. With each crusade, he became more and more popular. Billy understood the power of the media. He immersed himself in it. He went on every television program and did every single interview he could. No matter what show or interview he was on, he stayed true to his mission to preach the gospel of Christ to the world. As his popularity grew, so did his critics. In the 50s and 60s, Southern fundamentalists criticized him of rejecting the practice of preaching to segregated crowds. Instead, everywhere he preached, he had the segregation ropes taken down himself and said we were all equal before God, and he refused to preach Jim Crow, as he put it. He did this in several places across the South, including his Jackson, Mississippi crusade in 1952. Billy Graham was also good friends with Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King said had it not been for Dr. Billy Graham, his work on the civil rights movement would not have been as successful as it has been. Billy Graham was a spiritual counselor to world leaders around the globe. Not only did he meet every president from Truman to Trump, but each president from Truman to George W. Bush had reason to call on Billy at some point. But Graham's relationship with presidents got off to a rocky start with President Truman in 1950. After Billy's meeting with Truman, he walked outside and told the newspaper reporters everything they had talked about in their meeting, and him and his team reenacted the prayer that they had had with the president. The picture of them doing this was on newspapers across the country the next day. Billy did not know at the time that you are not supposed to talk about what you talked about with the president in the Oval Office. Truman never invited him back to the White House. President Eisenhower summoned Billy to ask his counsel on sending troops to Little Rock to enforce the law against segregation. President Kennedy called on Billy to ask advice on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Billy Graham was good friends with President Johnson, Ford, Carter, Reagan, both Bushes, and Clinton. Billy Graham was also a good friend of Richard Nixon. After the Watergate scandal, Nixon continued to call him Billy. He also met with many other world leaders, including Margaret Thatcher and Queen Elizabeth from Britain, as well as presidents and prime ministers from China, Japan, North and South Korea, Mexico, and Argentina. One of the most tense times in Billy Graham's life was when he went through the communist Iron Curtain to preach the gospel. He was invited to preach in countries like Hungary and Poland. Although there was a risk, he felt like God was calling him to minister to these people. But Billy Graham was not satisfied. He wanted to go deeper into communist territory. As he says in his book, we are grateful for the doors God has opened for us in Hungary and Poland, but all along our prayer was that another door would open, the door to the hardest and strategic place of all, the Soviet Union. In 1982, the Russian Orthodox Church invited Billy Graham to an event called the World Conference of Religious Workers for Saving the Sacred Gift of Life from Nuclear Catastrophe. It was a gathering of religious leaders of major world religions, not just Christianity. This was a very big decision for Billy Graham because it was no secret that these conferences were used for propaganda. If he went, he could be used as propaganda for the Soviet Union. If he refused the invitation, the Soviet Union could be offended and never ask him back. Despite the risk, he decided to go. He preached in many crowded Russian cathedrals. His trip was successful, and in 1991 he returned to Russia and met Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia. As Billy Graham got older, he started to stay closer to home and spent more time with his family. A few days after the September 11th attacks in New York City, Bush wanted Billy Graham to preach at the 9/11 memorial service at the National Cathedral. There was one problem. No civilian aircraft were allowed to fly because of the attacks. Bush worked with the Defense Department and convinced them to let one aircraft fly. On the morning of the service, only one civilian aircraft was flying above the nation, and it was bringing Billy Graham to Washington. In the words of President Bush, "The nation was in shock, and just being in his presence gave you a sense of calm, and the nation severely needed calm." Billy Graham's last crusade was in 2005 in New York City. In his final years, as his health declined, he removed himself from the spotlight. In 2007, his wife, Ruth Bell, died. She had been his wife and faithful supporter in his ministry for nearly 64 years. Billy Graham died of natural causes on February 21st, 2018, at the age of 99. Thousands lined the streets and roads of North Carolina as his body was taken to his funeral service. At his funeral, hundreds attended, including former Presidents Carter, both Bushes, Clinton, and President Trump. He also had a funeral service at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, making him only the fourth private U.S. citizen in history to have a funeral service there. Billy Graham's legacy lives on in the lives of his children, who are all part of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, which is spreading the gospel of Christ around the globe.